One of the reasons I have always wanted to invite Dr. Rendsburg to BYU is because we share a same mentor, Cyrus Gordon, who is one of those last great scholars of the ancient Near East. There aren't very many around. In fact, there's probably nobody around them anymore like them. Albright was one, and Cyrus Gordon was one, and Gary Rendsburg is probably one too. He takes after Cyrus Gordon in many, many ways. He holds the Blanche and Irving Laurie Chair of Jewish History at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. He's also the chair of the Department of Jewish Studies. I nailed him down last night over dinner, and he said that he is trying to get a master's program started there, and we wish him success in that. I promised him that we would send him students if he did. So get your grades in order, okay, if you're thinking of it. He joined Rutgers in 2004 after 18 years at Cornell University in Ithaca. Prior to that, he taught 6 years at how do you say that? Canisius College. What's that?
One of the first Jesuits, Peter Canisius.
Oh, cool. It was a Jesuit college. Good. He earned his BA in English from University of North Carolina and his PhD in Hebrew Studies from New York University in 1980. I'm going to plug an article of his in Puns and Pundits. If you haven't seen it and you're really interested in the Bible, I would highly recommend this. It's a fun book to read. It's dense, too. I mean, this is not light reading, most of it anyway. But this talks about all of the fun things that they would do with the Hebrew text in the ancient world. And he has an article in here that's really one of the, do I dare say one of the best ones in it? Or?
Well, thank you.
He reminded me last night that he had an article in here. I had read this, but I didn't pay any attention to the authors in it when I read it. I just read it cover to cover because it was so fun. And by the way, how do you say his name? I've always wondered.
Nagel.
Nagel.
Over umlaut.
Oh, you do the over the umlaut. All right.
Nagel became
Nagel, Scott Nagel, who you're working on another book together with him. That's great. Anyway, we're going to hear about light from Egypt on the Exodus today from one of the people who is capable of talking about that, Dr. Rendsburg.
Thank you very much, Paul, and Dan before Paul, for these lovely introductions. And I'm going to, style will be a little bit different from yesterday when I was behind the podium, and I thought I would do more of a classroom kind of thing and be in front of it with this portable mic. I hope you can all hear me well, and that you all have a copy of the handout, which we'll be looking at. Now, what I've done here is begin with a pair of biblical texts, interrelated passages from chapter 4 and chapter 7 of Exodus. But after that, we will move to a study of a variety of Egyptian texts and also some artwork as well, and see what kind of light from Egypt can be shed on the Exodus narrative. I begin by noting this is a talk about light from Egypt on the Exodus story, that is to say, as it is presented in the Bible, Exodus chapters 1 through 15, and not on the Exodus itself, the historical issues, which is a whole other discussion. So you won't hear me say, for example, the Merneptah steal any time during the next 50 minutes, other than the reference that I've just made. I'm talking about literary parallels, essentially, between Egyptian texts and biblical texts. So we begin with a look at these two passages. I actually put them here in reverse order, chapter 7, verse 1 passage before the other one. It's always good, especially in an ancient Near Eastern student group, to hear the text in Hebrew before we read it in English translation. The first passage there, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe, Re'eh netaticha Elohim leFaro, ve'Aharon achicha yiyeh neviecha. This is God speaking to Moses right before Moses and Aaron are to appear before Pharaoh in the palace. Look, I have set you as a god to Pharaoh, Elohim leFaro, and Aharon, or Aaron, your brother, will be your prophet. As clear as could be. In the previous passage, Exodus chapter 4, verse 16, which is atop Mount Sinai still, at the continuation of the burning bush scene, God said to Moses, Moses' fourth objection, we'll talk about his objections later on, his fourth objection to becoming the leader of the Israelites was that he was not a good speaker, to which God responded, V'hayahu, referring to Aaron, Hu yeh lecha lefeh v'ata tiyeh lo le'Elohim. And it will be, he, meaning Aaron, will be for you as a mouth, which is here metaphorical for mouthpiece or spokesperson or prophet, if you will. And you will be for him as a god. Okay, so now, how's this possible? How's it possible for Moses to be at the stature of God and Aaron, as you can see here, to be at the status of prophet? If I were to ask you, in ancient Israel, what is the highest level that a human being could achieve? The answer would be prophet. Okay? So we're going to begin with God on the top of our hierarchy, prophet as the highest level that any human being could achieve. And what's the second highest level a human being can achieve? In a religious setting, priest. Okay? Or high priest even. Thanks, Dana. In the biblical tradition, the prophet par excellence is Moses. And the priest par excellence, the first high priest, is Aaron. So what has happened in these two passages here at the beginning of Exodus is that Moses has been promoted to the level of deity, and Aaron has been promoted to the level of prophet. So this is the way you have to understand these two passages here. Now, this is going to be what we call temporary promotion, because they will eventually be reduced back to the levels which they normally have, which, of course, is Moses as the great prophet and Aaron as the first high priest of Israel. So what's going on in these biblical texts? How do we explain this? First of all, let's note that within the context of ancient Israel, this would be heretical, because Israel is distinct from the other nations in the ancient Near East in the following way. In the other countries of the Near East, in the other cultures of the Near East, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and so on, the gods operate in their realm, and there is a distance, there's quite a chasm between the humans and the deities. The deities are to be feared. They're associated with nature, the great powers of nature, storms, the sea, and so on. And human society stands in fear of those deities and needs to worship them to keep them at bay very frequently. In Israel, as you all know, the relationship between God and the people of Israel is perceived in a very, very different fashion. There is a very close connection between God and Israel, which is concretized in the covenant concept, which permeates, of course, the biblical material. And yet, notwithstanding, so if I were to physically portray these, I would say the distance between the gods and humans in the polytheistic cultures would be something like this, and in ancient Israel it would be something like this, where God and man are very, very closely linked to each other. But notwithstanding this very small distance, for a human being in the context of ancient Israel to achieve the level of the divine would be heretical. That small space cannot be bridged. By contrast, this very large space that exists in the polytheistic world can be bridged, because selected human beings can achieve the level of the divine. So, for example, Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia becomes deified at some point. Imhotep in Egypt, the great builder of the designer of the pyramid and the great sage of the Old Kingdom period, is later on seen as a deity as well. In the Greek realm, selected human beings like Heracles and Prometheus are moved from that human level to the divine level. And most importantly, especially for what we are doing in ancient Egypt, every pharaoh is considered divine. As the son of the sun god Ra and as the god Horus incarnate, those two elements bring a level of deity to every Egyptian pharaoh. So those are the kinds of things that can happen in the other cultures of the ancient world that cannot happen in Israel. And yet, remarkably, in these two passages, the biblical author sets aside the theology of Israel for the exigencies of the moment and the literary need, which is to make Moses the equal to Pharaoh. Since Moses is appearing before Pharaoh here, and Pharaoh is himself a god in the Egyptian setting, therefore the biblical author portrays Moses and makes Moses in a deity as well for this one tete-a-tete before Pharaoh in the royal court in Egypt. Now, I want you to understand this as something like a summit conference. So in modern geopolitics, if the G7 are going to send their heads of state to a meeting, every country has to send its head of state. We send our president, Britain sends its prime minister, and so on. If the G7 are going to have a meeting of foreign ministers, then we'll send our Secretary of State. If they're going to have a meeting of Treasury ministers, we'll send our Treasury minister, Secretary of the Treasury. You have to meet as equals. Or in the old days of the Cold War, if the Soviet Union was going to send its premier, we had to send our president. We couldn't send the vice president or some lower-level cabinet member. We would be at disadvantage if you didn't meet as equals. And that's how I understand what's going on here, that Moses, that Pharaoh is at the divine level, and so for the purposes of this story alone, the story sets aside ancient Israelite theology and elevates Moses to the level of God, of deity. And Aaron has to go along with him in this climb up the ladder and goes from priest to prophet. That's how those two passages are understood. This is temporary promotion. We never get a statement that Moses once is demoted to the level of prophet and Aaron demoted to the level of priest. That is just assumed and built in. And I also want you to know that the concept of temporary promotion is something that actually operates in contemporary society, especially in the military. Some of you may have military experience. One of the most famous examples in American military history is, in fact, George Custer. Before he became famous for his death and defeat at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, he actually underwent temporary promotion at the Battle of Gettysburg. You can look it up on Wikipedia, that great source of knowledge. Okay, so where George Custer went from, lieutenant to major or something like that for the sake of commanding more troops for that one battle at Gettysburg. I think it was on the third of the 3 days of the Gettysburg battle. So this is what happens from time to time, and we do have examples of this, and the temporary promotion concept is how you should understand what's happening here with Moses and Aaron in these two passages, and you can see why, because of the Pharaoh. Now, that sets the stage for our now going back and looking at some biblical passages that occurred earlier. I don't reproduce all the text because I'm going to assume some basic knowledge on your part of what those biblical texts are like, and I refer first of all to chapter 2 of the book of Exodus, which is the famous story of Moses' birth. Now, Moses' birth account is part of a much larger tradition in the ancient Near East called the exposed infancy motif, and we have several dozen examples of this from the ancient world, and the basic storyline goes as follows. The parents of the child, for whatever reason, do not seek to keep the child or are unable to keep the child, and therefore they expose the newborn baby to the wilds of nature. Miraculously, of course, these babies never die of starvation out there in the woods or something like that. They're always found by someone, adopted, raised by that individual, and grow up to become the leaders of their people. So this is a motif about leadership in the ancient world. Most famous examples of this, what comes to mind in the exposed infant motif? Oedipus, set aside by his parents on a hillside, where a shepherd adopts him. Sargon, the famous Sargon story from ancient Mesopotamia, which is very closely linked to the Moses story, as we'll see in a moment. And perhaps the oddest of all the exposed infancy motifs, because the twins were not found by a human being, but by a she-wolf, Romulus and Remus. And I always wanted to do some sort of biological experiment to see if human babies could be nursed by a she-wolf milk or something. But anyway, that's the myth of the founding of Rome. So this is the great motif of antiquity, right? Now, the Sargon one is typically seen as closest to the Moses story because of all those examples from antiquity. We have the close parallel is that in the case of Sargon's mother, she also makes a little basket out of reeds and puts the baby in it and floats it on the river. And he's found by a man named Aki, who is the water drawer for the area, and he raises him. And of course, Sargon grows up to become king of Akkad. Now, I want to suggest that that's not the closest parallel to the Moses story. And in fact, the closest parallel to the Moses story is the birth story of Horus in Egypt. And let me explain why. Notwithstanding these close parallels between the Sargon story and the biblical account, there's one major difference. In all of the exposed infancy birth stories, including that of Sargon, it is the desire of the parents to do away with the child, right? And the modern equivalent, by the way, we still have modern exposed infancy births in our own mythology, such as Tarzan and other examples of it. And probably the other motif, if this helps you along, is sort of, as you might see, not so much in movies anymore, but back in the grand old days of 1940s and 50s movies, perhaps leaving a baby in a basket by the gate to the monastery, that kind of, or to the where the nuns live, to that kind of place. So this is a motif of how you ensure babies are going to be kept. But in the biblical story, the desire of Moses' parents, with a focus on his mother most of all, who's the active partner there, is to ensure that Moses will be saved. That's obviously what is distinguishing the biblical account from these other accounts. Oedipus' parents want to make sure that he's not saved, for example. And that's similarly with the story of Sargon of Akkad. So the biblical story is quite different, and that's not of course, if you think about it, not shocking in the least, given the fact that the mentality in biblical Israel would be, of course, to preserve life in every which way possible. The only parallel to this account, where the parents, or the mother in particular, wants to save the baby, is the story of Horus' birth in Egypt. Now, what I've done here is put a family tree on the board for you of the Egyptian, relevant Egyptian deities here. The gods Osiris and Seth are brothers, and I've indicated their relationship by the names of their parents are not important, so I haven't put them on the board there, but there are two lines that descend from the same parents. And Osiris and Seth are seen in a continual battle between the two of them. Seth embodies everything that is evil and chaotic in the Egyptian realm, in the Egyptian mindset, the way they understood the world. He is portrayed as a disgusting-looking creature, which even Egyptologists are unsure as to what it is. Part hyena, part pig, part this, part that. Osiris is his brother is associated with that which is good. Now, the battle. Egyptians frequently call this text the contendings of Horus and Seth, or however they may want to call it. It's an ongoing series of battles between Seth and Osiris. We'll get to Horus in a moment. And Seth wins the day by killing Osiris. And Osiris accordingly becomes the god who was associated with death and the underworld, which in all cultures of the ancient Near East would be a very negative place. But in Egypt, with its specific and unique concept of the afterlife, is a very positive experience. And so Osiris' goodness is now associated as being the god of the next world, and the god of the dead, and the god of eternity, and things like that. Now, before Osiris died, he impregnated his wife, Isis, who's the goddess of wisdom and beauty. And after Osiris' death, Isis gives birth to Horus. Seth now finds out that the seed, the offspring of his now deceased brother Osiris, lives, and so it's now Seth's task to go and kill Horus. And Seth comes viciously after the baby Horus. And it is at this point where the mother Isis hides him in a basket along the banks of the Nile. And so what I have for you here are in the middle of page 1, are a series of texts dealing with the Horus and Seth conflict. The first set, the two passages there, come from what is known as Papyrus Jumulhak, the P period. You'll see that throughout this handout. P period means, as the abbreviation Egyptologists use for papyrus. It's a late text. It comes from the Ptolemaic period, that is sometime after Alexander the Great. And what we have is an attempt to explain the various names of the gods of ancient Egypt. And you can see it begins, Seth was ranging about looking for Horus, and the passage reads, his mother hid him in a papyrus thicket. Now, there is this fluidity to the pantheon of ancient Egypt, as there is most pantheons in antiquity, so there's an attempt here to associate Horus somehow with Anubis, who's yet another god. And the wordplay operates with this word inpu, which is the word for Anubis, and also the word for a royal child. And so you can see the royal child is in the papyrus stick. It sounds like Moses, right? And then there's another attempt to explain the name where the word for boat, yenep, and other terms which are being used here as well, are trying to explain how the baby Horus and Anubis are all one and the same, and so on. Those are direct quotations from that Egyptian text. The one beneath that is my own summary, summarizing the Horus and Seth story, piecing together a variety of texts which appear from the Old Kingdom onward, and except where I have direct quotation marks, which is lifted from an actual Egyptian text, and that is Isis suckled the child in solitude, no one knew where. And this is all about Seth coming after Horus here. Now, you take that knowledge, and you now take a look at the biblical account. One more point about the Egyptian material. Horus is the god of kingship. He is portrayed as the falcon. Go into any Egyptian museum if you've ever been, and you see lots of falcon imagery. That is always the god Horus. And the pharaoh is seen as the living embodiment of Horus, or he is Horus incarnate. So they are one and the same. Now, a moment ago I said Horus, the pharaoh is the son of Ra or Re, and that's also true in a different aspect of Egyptian mythology. And here I'm telling you that Horus is the god of kingship, who is the pharaoh, who is the son of Osiris. Don't worry about these conflicts, which to our mind are somewhat illogical, but to the ancient Egyptians could all be subsumed in the way they understood the pantheon because of this fluidity of deities. Now, in some Egyptian statuary, in fact, you'll actually see the pharaoh seated in his throne and the wings of the falcon coming around behind him. They almost morph into one entity together. So, if Horus is the pharaoh, and Horus's birth is of this type where his mother Isis has to put him in the basket and float him in the Nile to protect him from the machinations of his wicked uncle Seth, what's going on in the biblical story? This is the subversion of an Egyptian myth. Moses in that story becomes Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh in that story in Exodus 2 becomes who? Seth. So this is how the Israelites are subverting the basic foundational myth of ancient Egypt by making Moses to be the hero of their myth and making the Pharaoh, who should be their hero, to be the villain of that myth. This is what's going on in the biblical account. And so you take these two passages from Exodus 4 and 7, and you see Moses at the level of the divine as the equal to Pharaoh, and now it begins to permeate the myths that you see here if you take these parallels that I'm positing here for you. And that's the way these biblical texts have to be understood. It assumes, I'll say this from the outset, but this will be true for all the other texts that we will look at, that the ancient author knows a lot about Egyptian mythology and Egyptian culture and Egyptian religion, and also assumes that his Israelite audience, for whom these texts are intended, will have a knowledge of ancient Egyptian culture and religion and mythology as well. And at no point were Israel and Egypt ever out of touch with one another, and so this would be part of what every average Israelite would have known these features of ancient Egypt. And so the educated Israelite could understand what's going on here in these biblical accounts. Notice the emphasis on Isis nursing Horus, the baby Horus. Unfortunately, I neglected to put examples of that on the artwork. There you see some artwork on the last page, which we'll get to in a moment. I also probably should have shown you some of these pictures because another motif of ancient Egyptian art is Isis nursing the baby Horus. There's lots of examples of that in Egyptian statuary, and so you see it in the text, you see it in the artwork, and that, of course, accords most importantly with the biblical passage which tells us that Moses' sister went and got Moses' mother to nurse the baby. They're not named there. Of course, we know that the sister's name is Miriam and the mother's name is Yochebed. We know that from later texts, but that's the two characters there. And so the emphasis on the baby's mother doing the nursing, which of course is in itself ironic because the Pharaoh's own daughter is the one who's adopting the child at this point. You can see how all of this material from Egypt is being recycled and subverted, as I mentioned before. Okay, let's move on to the next part of this material. We'll get back to the little thing at the bottom of the page. Well, let's do it as long as we're at the bottom of page 1. Let's just quickly mention it. I don't know to what extent this is coincidental I don't know to what extent this is important, but I do want to point out that there is this passage in a 20th dynasty papyrus about Horus and Seth, where Thoth, this god of writing and scribes, writes a letter to the god Re, and says about Horus and Seth, "What shall we do about these two people who for 80 years now have been before the tribunal, and no one knows how to judge between the two?" Anybody get the reference to 80 years there? What's important about that? Where does that appear in the Moses story? Anybody know?
Is he not 80 when he came back?
He is 80 years old when he appears before Pharaoh. So, and take a look, I think it's chapter 7, verse 6. It's very odd. It just interrupts the story. It's exactly before Moses is going to appear with Aaron before Pharaoh. And why does the Bible stop to tell us that Aaron was 83 and Moses was 80 at that point? Obviously, we know Aaron's older, and Moses was 80 years old. So I don't know to what extent this is a coincidence, but I throw it out there as another possibility of a biblical passage which is just tangential to the story. You certainly don't need it. It could have just been, passage could have been skipped. And yet there must be some importance to noting Moses' age there as 80. Now, of course, it all works because there's going to be 40 years of wandering and he'll die at 120. But all of that is still to come later on in the other books of the Pentateuch. Okay. Now, let's continue with chapter 3 of the book of Exodus. And Moses is now atop Mount Sinai, the famous story of the burning bush. And as I mentioned earlier, he has 4 objections. God tells him he's going to be the leader of the Israelites. You're going to go to Pharaoh and you're going to bring the people out of Egypt. And Moses presents 4 objections. The first one is something like, "Who am I?" And God says to him, "When you bring them out of Egypt, you'll bring them back here to this mountain and they will worship me." Well, this is a little problematic because I've never myself quite understood how's that supposed to help Moses. After the fact, you're going to bring them back here to Mount Sinai, and that's why you're going to be the leader. So that doesn't really work too well. And it's no surprise that Moses has a second objection very quickly, moves beyond that first question and God's response, and then brings up the question of God's name. He says, when I go back to Egypt, the people are going to ask me, what is his name, Ma Shemo? And God says that you should then tell the people, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, variously translated as I will be who I will be, or I am who I am, or however we want to understand those very enigmatic Hebrew words. I mean, the words themselves all make sense to us, but how they all fit together. And as I'm sure all you know, this is a name of God that appears nowhere else in the Bible. It appears only here. It may be alluded to, probably is alluded to in Hosea chapter 1, where the word Ehyeh occurs, or maybe it's chapter 2 of Hosea. But otherwise, this is not a name, of course, that resonates throughout the Bible. That story in Exodus 3 does equate this name with the standard name of God in the Hebrew Bible, Yahweh, but we do get a very enigmatic name there. God's response to Moses' question is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I will be who I will be. Now, my understanding of that passage is as follows. On page 2 of the handout, I reproduce a good chunk of a text called the unknown name of Ra. Ra is the sun god, the chief god of the, if there is a chief god through the Egyptian Pantheon, it's Ra, or Re. And this is from a text which is in the Turin Museum in Italy. And it's about Isis seeking to learn the name of Ra. We're not going to have time to read it all aloud here. We all know that Ra has the name Ra. That's not a problem, which, by the way, is just a simple Egyptian word for sun, S-U-N, sun. And she seeks to learn his secret name or his special name. And in the 3rd paragraph there, Ra says to her, my father and mother told me my name at birth, middle of the page. I have hidden it in my body since birth so as to prevent the power of a male magician or a female magician from working against me. Now, for the Egyptians, as for many people in antiquity, magic is a way of subverting the work of the gods, right? And so you can use this kind of magical praxis, black magic in particular, to get something to occur that the gods themselves are not going to do. It's tied into religious traditions in the ancient Near East. Not in Israel, of course, where, as you all know, there are many, many passages in the Torah which prohibit various types of divination, sorcery, witchcraft, and we run out of English words. There are so many Hebrew terms that are consulting the dead and so on for the biblical, all those prohibitions that one finds there. Now, they go back and forth, and Ra refuses to give her his name, but she is the goddess of wisdom, and so she feels it is her right to know this name. You can see the second paragraph begins, "Now Isis was a wise woman." So what she does is prepares a venomous snake which comes and bites Ra. And you can see in the little paragraph down 2/3 down the page, the poison burned with a burning. It was more powerful than flame or fire. And they continue to go back and forth, and finally she tells him that if you give me the name, I will give the antidote and the venom will no longer be harming you, but I need to know your name. With no choice, next to last paragraph, the end of the next to last paragraph, with no choice left, the great god, meaning Ra, announced his name to Isis, the great one of magic. Now, by the way, I referred to Isis as the goddess of wisdom, but you realize wisdom and magic are one and the same. In fact, our English word wizard, which we usually associate with a person doing magic, is of course nothing then is related to our English word for wisdom and wise. So this is all to be seen as tied together. Special wisdom is, of course, magic. And then in the last paragraph, you can read it for yourself. She undoes the venom. Now, how is this all related to what's going on in Exodus chapter 3? Right? The polytheists believed, and you see this in this story here, that if you have some special, apparently the gods have a special, this god in particular has a special name, and if you know that name, you can perform magic against him in a type of voodoo fashion where you have control over the god because you know his special name. The Bible, of course, a totally different perspective on this, understands that there is no magic in the world. These are all prohibitions. They have no force whatsoever. And if they did, Yahweh, to be sure, could never be harmed by such magical praxis. So I understand Moses' question to God. The people are going to say to me, Ma Shemo, what is his name? When I go back to Egypt, they're going to say, what is his name? They're not looking for the Yahweh name, which every Israelite would have known, or even the word Elohim, which is a more generic word for God. They're looking for that special name that Yahweh must have, because Ra has a special name, Yahweh must have one too. So there's your parallel. And the name that is divulged is indeed a special name that is used nowhere else in the Bible, Ehyeh, Asher, Ehyeh. That's where the stories are similar. And now we go to where they're different. What's the difference between the Egyptian story we've just looked at and the biblical story in Exodus 3? Who wants to answer that? Yeah.
The Egyptian story actually doesn't give you his name.
Correct. In the Egyptian story, who learns the name? Isis. But you, the reader, do not learn the name. It would be too dangerous for the author of the story to divulge Ra's secret name to the public at large. And in the biblical account, and the second point, the other point is here, before we turn to the biblical account, is that the divulging of the name can occur only after a great give and take between the two, with this venomous snake biting Ra and so on and so forth. By contrast, in the biblical account, if you want to know God's secret name, what do you have to do? Just ask, and you get it. Right? Why? Because God can, and the whole world can know his secret name. Because even if you know the name, there's no way that any of this could harm the great God of Israel. So this is playing off again an Egyptian cultural element by having the biblical story spend so much time on Moses asking God his name and then the revelation of that very, very atypical, unusual, quote-unquote, secret name of God. Next objection Moses has. They're not going to believe me. I need some power to show that I am, in fact, empowered by you, the God of Israel, to do this before Pharaoh. So the power that God gives Moses is he tells him to, what's that in your hand? You all know the story, chapter 4, a staff. It's the staff he uses to shepherd the sheep. Throws it on the ground, it turns into a snake, picks it up, and turns back into the staff. This is something the Egyptians believed. They believed, and this is the story on page 3 called the wax crocodile story. They believed that great magicians could turn inanimate objects into animate objects and then back again. Time doesn't allow us to read this story, but I ask you to read it on your own. It's an absolutely delightful tale. The Egyptians love to tell these stories. They have wonderful storytelling techniques, and they love these stories. And we'll look at another story from Papyrus Westcart in a few minutes. This is all on the same papyrus, which is a series of stories that they love to tell about these magicians. And so the great magician, Weba Oner, he's called here the chief lector priest, but that's another term for one of these great magicians, manufactures a wax crocodile about 7 fingers long. I picture the kind of little rubber alligators you can buy in the gift shops in Florida. And you throw it into the lake, into the pond, and it turns into a real crocodile, 7 cubits long. And then you grab hold of it, and it turns back into the wax crocodile again. So that's the basis of the story here. And that's what Moses does as well, correct? He's able to turn the staff into the snake and back into the staff. Now, when Moses is on Mount Sinai and God tells him to do this, the staff turns into the Hebrew word, nachash, snake. When he actually goes before Pharaoh in chapter 7 with Aaron and he performs this act, the biblical text uses a different word, and it uses the Hebrew word tanin. What does tanin mean? To my mind, it means crocodile. Lots of biblical translations translate it as serpent, because they figure it's got to be something like the snake that was earlier, and so they use the word serpent, but serpent really isn't a zoological term of any sort. It's just some sort of, otherworldly kind of thing, perhaps. And so in an attempt to find the actual zoological equivalent to Hebrew tanin, elsewhere in the Bible it does mean crocodile. In Ezekiel, for example. And so here, when he turns it into a crocodile, I think you are getting another closer parallel to this Egyptian story. I would even go so far as to say that the difference between the two terms is that when he's on Mount Sinai and he turns it into another creature, a reptile creature, it can only turn into a snake. Why? Look at where?
There's only snakes in
You're in the desert, You're in Utah. Right? But when you go before Pharaoh on the banks of the Nile, you can turn it into a crocodile, because look at the topographical setting. So that's what's going on with the two different terms there between chapter 4, where he's empowered by God, and then in chapter 7, where he actually performs this with Aaron before Moses. And the proof that the Egyptians could do this is what? What's their response when Aaron's rod turns into a crocodile? They do it with their own, and it turns into taninim. And of course, we know the Egyptians can do this. Here you have it, right? You'll understand the little humor in my mouth when I say these things in my speech, but you get the point that I'm trying to bring out here. Back to Mount Sinai, and for this you have to look at the last page of the artwork. When God tells Moses to pick up the snake, he tells him to pick it up how? By the tail. Now, when you pick up a snake, as you do on a regular basis, I'm sure, you pick it up where? Okay, right behind the neck and behind the head. And so look at the artwork. These are Horus stelae. These are well known. Every Egyptian museum in the world has at least one Horus stela on display. And this is Horus, typically as a young man, a lad, as you see in the bottom one and the one in the upper right, holding snakes and other creatures, incidentally, as well, by the tail. And in the one in the upper left, he's actually now portrayed as real Horus in falcon style, falcon-headed adult style. And he's picking up snakes and some of these other creatures, or scorpions from time to time. So always by the tail. This is a little bit of the information that you get from ancient Egypt, which sheds so much light on a biblical passage. Okay, back to our text. The 10 plagues. Various ways of looking at the plagues. By the way, I should just finish the account, which is to say the third objection is responded to by the power of the snake. And then the fourth objection takes us back to the beginning. He says, I'm not a good speaker, and that's when God, of course, tells him, Aaron will be your prophet, your spokesperson. Okay, now let's move ahead to the 10 plagues. People have sought to explain these through all sorts of scientific explanations, and indeed the plagues are capable of, are patient of such explanation, because the kinds of things that are referred to there are things that are known from ancient Egypt. You know, there is a Nile, there are frogs, okay, as an example, as you would find in any large river. And of course, there is no plague such as a blizzard. Why? Well, obviously it never rains or snows in Egypt. So there, to some extent, yes, these plagues do match the natural life of ancient Egypt. But I am much more impressed by seeing the plagues as, again, literary responses to things that the Egyptians themselves talked about. Can we do this for every single one of the 10 plagues? The answer is no. But at least for 3 of the plagues, I want to show you what we can do here. The first one, the river is turned to blood. Now, the Egyptians associate this with barbarians coming from outside of Egypt. These are not to be historically connected to the Israelites. You'll notice that the date of the admonitions of Ipuwer is 2050 BCE. We are about 800 years or so before any Israelites are in Egypt. So these are motifs, these are parallels, these are not obviously the same event that's being referred to here. Similarly, in the next one, the prophecy of Neferrohu, from a few decades later, you have reference to the sun being covered. Okay, so this, of course, is very similar to the 9th plague of darkness. But best of all, vis-a-vis the 9th plague, is the selection I have here in the middle of the of page 4. The Egyptians told stories about Set-Nehamwis, who was one of their great magicians. He is the son of Ramses II, the great pharaoh, who almost without a doubt is the pharaoh who enslaved the Israelites. And in one story, there's a story about Set-Nehamwis and another, his son, called Osiris, who surpasses his father even. This would be, therefore, be the grandson of Ramses II. You're following all this? And then he, Osiris, quotes an unnamed Nubian magician. Okay, so there's a whole string of magicians here that are being described in this text. It's in the British Museum. You can see P period BM 604, right? That means Papyrus, British Museum 604, or as we fondly refer to the British Museum, using Jewish terminology, the Third Temple. Okay, it's the play. Okay. You should all make pilgrimages one day to Jerusalem and to the British Museum. Now, this Nubian magician says, were it not that Amun, again one of the great gods, would find fault with me, and that the king of Egypt would punish me, I would cast my sorceries upon Egypt and make the people of Egypt spend 3 days and 3 nights seeing no light, only darkness. This is so closely linked to the 9th plague, which of course is 3 days and 3 nights as well. So these are things that the Egyptians believed that their magicians could do, and therefore not only is Moses being portrayed as the equal to Pharaoh, but throughout these stories he is being portrayed as the equal to the great magicians. But if you read the biblical stories, the first, and of course the proof again, Gary says with some humor, the proof again is that in the first 2 plagues, blood and frogs, when Moses and Aaron do this, what's the response of the Egyptian magicians? They do the same. They can duplicate this. They believe they could do these things, right? So the story is working off of that. It's only in the 3rd plague where the Egyptian magicians give up, cannot reproduce the lice, and then they say this is the finger of God. So these are, this is within the culture of ancient Egypt, and these texts indicate the kinds of things the Egyptians believed that magicians were capable of doing, or things that could occur, such as the darkness or the Nile turning to blood. Incidentally, I don't have this on the handout here, incidentally, the magicians, the Egyptian magicians, who disappear after plague number 3, return for one reference in one of the other plagues. Anybody know where it is? I call it a cameo appearance. Anybody know which plague it is? The 6th plague, which is the plague of skin disease of some sort, boils, against the people of Egypt. It says that also the Egyptian magicians were afflicted by it. Now, who were these magicians? They were not just magicians. They were the priests in the temples as well, as this wax crocodile story indicates. Herodotus tells us that, and we know this from Egyptian texts as well, but I'll cite Herodotus here. Herodotus tells us, his book 2 of his wonderful 9-book history is all about Egypt, and he visited Egypt, that the Egyptian priests were fanatical when it came to the purity of their skin, and that they shaved every day, their entire bodies, to make sure that there was no imperfections on their skin. Because if there were, even a hair would be for them an imperfection accordingly. If there were, this would disqualify them from serving in the temples. So when the biblical passage tells us that the Egyptian priests were also afflicted with the Sheheen, the boils, this is a way of telling us that they themselves are now, in their own world, unable to perform the rituals in the temples. And if that can't be done, the whole Pantheon collapses, right? So you can see how the biblical text is alluding to things that the Egyptians which would resonate in Egyptian culture, which the Israelite readers would know about. The last two passages on page 4 refer to the 10th plague. I wish we knew more about this, but we don't. Two very enigmatic passages in Egyptian texts, one of which refers to the day of the slaying of the firstborn, and remarkably, the one at the bottom of the page on a coffin text refers to the night of the slaying of the firstborn. Wouldn't we love to know more about what this meant in an Egyptian context? We don't, but what it tells us is that the biblical passage, the biblical 10th plague, again resonates with something very, very Egyptian. Last thing to talk about is the great culmination of the story, the climax of the story, which of course is the splitting of the Reed Sea in chapter 14 and 15 of Exodus. The Egyptians believed that their magicians could separate waters as well. And on page 5, I have two examples of it. The less important text is the one at the top here. Again, it's a text about Set Nechamwis, the great magician we referred to earlier. Although in this case, it talks about a different magician who's a companion of his named Non-Nefer Kaptah. That was my first choice when our son was born for his name. But somehow, it's a very beautiful name if you know the Egyptian. It means like the beautiful one of the soul of Ptah. Isn't that beautiful? But somehow my wife won out and we named him David. Okay. So Non-Nefer Kaptah is able to separate waters. And then the boating party is even a better example of it, again from the Westcar Papyrus, where the royal family's out on their boats on the lake having a party, a rowing party, and the pendant of one of the princesses falls into the lake, her turquoise pendant, and she wants it back. So the man who's telling the story said to her, row, I'll replace it for you. Well, I'll get you another turquoise pendant when we get back to shore, get back to town. But I guess when you're the princess of the royal family, you can be very demanding, and so she says, I prefer my thing to one like it. So the chief lector priest, Jaja Emanch, said his say of magic. He placed one side of the lake's waters upon the other, and he found the pendant. He brought it and gave it to its owner. Then he said his say of magic and returned the waters of the lake to their place. Right? So here you have again what the Egyptians believed about themselves, that magicians could do this kind of thing. They could separate waters out. Now I'm going to conclude with two thoughts. One I skipped a moment ago. Let me rewind the tape 5 minutes and say the following, and then we'll finish up with this one right here. The rewinding of the tape is as follows. In Plagues 1 and 2, and even Plague 3 where they attempt to do it, when the Egyptian magicians duplicate the plagues, the biblical text tells us that they did it how? By reciting their magic. Either belatehem, meaning with their spells, or belahatehem, the Hebrew has variant forms there, with their spells. They said their words, and that's how they were able to do these kinds of things. When Moses and Aaron do this, there's not a hint that there's any magic involved. They are able to do it. Why and how? They were directly empowered by Yahweh to do this. The Egyptian magicians have to use their say of magic. And so if you look at these Egyptian stories, and the biblical text is cognizant of that difference, it's a very clear difference, both in the turning the rod into an inanimate object and into the first two plagues. And if you look at these stories, the boating party here or the wax crocodile story, notice that the Egyptian magicians do this how? They say their magic, right? He said his say of magic. This would be the spells that the biblical text is referring to. So I want to point that out as well, and then finish here with the grand finale, which is as follows. Israel's in Egypt. Egypt has, let's turn this into a sports metaphor. Egypt has the home court advantage. We're going to play by Egypt's ground rules accordingly. This is what the biblical author is saying. Okay, Egypt, you think that your magicians can separate the waters, right? And do heroics thereby. Fine. We'll play with your rules, we'll play your game, and we'll use exactly that action to ensure that you yourselves drown. And so the Israelites pass through on dry land. The waters are brought back together, just like Jaja is able to do it here in the very delightful story with no theological ramifications of just finding the pendant at the bottom of the lake. And that's how we're going to ensure that you, the Egyptians, die. Beyond that, one further comment. The Egyptians believed that death by drowning was a noble way to die. Now, again, we don't know a lot about this, but it's something Herodotus tells us, and we see examples of it in tomb walls where they have references to death by drowning in the artwork. It may go back to another Osiris myth where he was not killed by his brother Seth, but rather he drowned. So we're not sure all about this. But again, it's as if the biblical writer was saying, we understand you, Egypt. You think death by drowning is the noble death? That's fine. We'll arrange it for you. Thank you very much. Questions? Should we be using the mic? I think that was the preference. So.
I've got two. The first being, why did the writer of Exodus 4:16 say Elohim instead of Adonai? That Moses becoming.
Right.
So anyway, there's that question, and then also, it seems to me the 10th plague is also very much the magician's progeny being affected, and therefore that was the last one. Because anyway,
right.
If you would comment on that as well.
So why should Moses be called Elohim in both of those biblical passages, chapter 4 and chapter 7, as opposed to using the tetragrammaton Yahweh or its replacement term Adonai? The answer is that the term Elohim is the generic word for God. Yahweh, read as Adonai in Jewish tradition, is only used for the God of Israel. And Elohim is the generic word for God. So if you're going to say that I'm going to make you a god, if you refer to the other gods of the ancient world, for example, you call them Elohim, because that's a single. Chemosh is the Elohim of Moab, right, for example. In Exodus 12, it tells us that the plagues are attacks against the Egyptian Elohim, for example. So you use it to refer to other deities. It's the generic word. So that's a simple response as to why the biblical author uses the word Elohim in both of those passages. And then the 10th plague, it's not, the death of the firstborn means that it's the death of the firstborn of those priests. It's the death of the firstborn of the Pharaoh, down to the handmaiden firstborn as well. And given the emphasis on firstbornhood status in ancient Egypt, it's again a reference to, I would say, the whole culture is going to collapse when the firstborn die. This is all part of the way this is to be understood. Yep.
Just one question over here.
Yep.
I'm curious, as you look at this polemic against the Egyptian pantheon, the next step, maybe a stepping stone. In Exodus 14 twice, it indicates that when we have the parting of Yam, that it's at Baal Zephon, which seems to indicate that this is, you have the polemic against the Egyptian pantheon on one side, and this launch into now a polemic against the Canaanite pantheon and the Ugarit influence perhaps and things. And I'm just wondering, as you think about, as you've looked at this, if you've launched into now another possible arena for water and storm polemics against Baalism in the Deuteronomic history.
Very interesting. I would prefer to keep it because the milieu is still Egypt. On the one hand, you could say, well, we're out of Egypt, we're moving to Canaan now, so this is the exact time to segue into that kind of a polemic. I would say a couple of things. Number one, these Canaanite gods were incorporated into the Egyptian pantheon during the New Kingdom. So Baal is equated with Seth. Seth, by the way, gets rehabilitated in the New Kingdom. Although he is seen as the god of chaos and evil and wickedness, as I mentioned earlier, he gets rehabilitated to the point where he's turned into a good god, so much so that Seti becomes a royal name in the 19th dynasty, Seti the first and Seti the second. Seti the first is Ramses the second's father, if I remember my chronology here, and Seti the second is later. So that's the name Seth, actually. And then he becomes equated with Baal as the storm god, which I guess would be a good thing. Yam is also incorporated to the Egyptian pantheon at this point in the New Kingdom. The Egyptians were great at it because there was such a large influx of people from Canaan, not just the Israelites, but others who came in to live in the Delta during the 19th dynasty. The Egyptians sort of opened up their pantheon and were able to incorporate more gods into that pantheon. So part of me says maybe it should be worked in at that level. And the other part of me says this is a very nice point. This is it. This is the end of Egypt, but we're going to segue immediately into a polemic against the Canaanite deity. So it could be working at two different levels here. I like that a lot. Thanks.
I just have a bunch of pendant notes to some of your comments. I really liked the presentation. On the Papyrus Westcar and so forth, the chief lector priest, the term there, Herihebet Hartibi, is the etymological origin of Hartumim, the magicians in the Hebrew Bible. On the parallels to the 10 plagues, better than Setnachamwas and Siosira for the days of darkness is the Tempest Stela of Ahmose, which has... unfortunately, the number of days isn't a break, but so many days of night where you couldn't, where it was dark and torches could not be lit.
Thank you for that reference. Okay, I do not know that text. Okay.
The parallel on the cannibal hymns, that day and that night of slaying. You can also check Coffin Text 335, Book of the Dead, 17, 18, 25, 50, 57. 39, 71, and 90. Plus, there are a number of other references in the coffin text.
Send them an email, John.
Yeah, I'll have to do that one. On the splitting of the sea, you get the reverse of that for the flooding in Papyrus Dormany.
Yeah, that I'm familiar with. Right.
With Bata. And also the drowning. If you look in the... drowning is not universally seen... as a good thing. It is in later times, obviously, with the Temple of Dendur and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as well as in Setnachamwas. But in earlier times, it's not really seen as a good thing. Unfortunately, my colleague Kerry Muhlstein, who's just done a whole thing on execution by water.
Oh, good.
An article on that. But specifically, if you look in the dialogue of a soul of a man with his Ba, the Ba talks about the punishments that come if you're out in a boating party at night and are capsized and drowned, and then there is no hope of being saved for you because the body can't be recovered, can't be mummified, and therefore you miss out on a glorious afterlife.
Right, so it's seen as a negative in that sense.
Yes.
Without the mummification, right.
So those are other... Seth also depends on where you are in Egypt.
Yes.
Because, of course, Seti is called Osiris in Abydos. And it's mainly just in Abydos that Seth is seen as evil. In the pyramid text, he's involved in purification ceremonies. Those are carried all the way down.
Yeah.
So there are a number of... It's more where you are.
And when you are.
No, actually, not so much when you are, just where you are.
More where, you think. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for those excellent points. In the back.
Just on the face of it, you could see parallels in New Testament narrative to the various characters that you've outlined, which I find interesting from a textual sense, not the religious sense, but the concept. I'm just curious, would it simply be New Testament copying of Israelite polemic against, or were the writers at New Testament time aware of these things and putting the same thing into their narrative?
Give me the specifics you're talking about from the New Testament.
Well, I would see a family escaping into Egypt from Herod.
Right.
A similar story.
Okay.
A father that's not known and a mother that is.
Yeah. Now, I would say that those are conscious. And again, I'm not a New Testament scholar at all, but those I would. I mean, I think this is the way most scholars of the gospel material would understand this. These are intentional reworkings or reflections or allusions to the Exodus material and to other Old Testament texts as well. I think that's what's going on there very, very clearly, right? You have to have the escape from Egypt again, right? This is a second Exodus, as it were.
In a totally different kind of discussion at synagogue a couple months ago, the rabbi was talking about the Moses story, as it was the parsha of the week, and I guess a year ago almost, and we were talking about Moses' sense of he's not acceptable to become even temporarily a god because of his anger problem, and he felt that God wouldn't accept him because he knew he was very quick to anger. So I don't know if that plays any part, or that's just another kind of look at the story.
Well, Moses' anger is quite clear, not in this story, but in subsequent narratives in the Torah. But that God is slow to anger, you're saying. Which is one of God's epithets in Exodus 34, for example. Well, other than, to me there's no sense that Moses could ever become a deity. It's just a literary construct for the moment, as I suggested at the beginning of the talk. It's quite an interesting contrast I hadn't contemplated, that we do have reference to Moses' short temper versus God's patience before becoming angry. So I like that little juxtaposition there. I'll have to think about that one further. Thanks. In the back again.
You mentioned that the plague 1 and 2 were duplicates of the plagues by magic spells. And if I remember right, the turning of the river into blood is one of them.
Right.
It was in the beginning, right? And but you really didn't get into the detail of the quote that you have here, so I'm kind of wondering, because it says, "The river is blood. If one drink of it, one rejects it and thirsts for water. Barbarians from outside have come to Egypt. They really are no people." Could you just explain that connection there? I don't think I got that.
Okay, so this 21st century BCE was a time of great upheaval in Egypt. It's what we call the first intermediate period, when there was sort of disorder and chaos in the ruling of Egypt. And so the Egyptians themselves have these texts, instructions, prophecies, whatever we want to call them, which describe the kind of chaos that's existing in the land. And so that one of the passages one of the statements they'll make, as you see in this particular text, is that things are so bad, A, barbarians have come in from outside, and B, the river is blood, right? There's no water to drink. Their understanding was that the Pharaoh ensures not only political stability, but cultural, and every stability, right? He is a god on earth, so he's ensuring political, cultural, what we would call today maybe feng shui for the whole country is all geared to the Pharaohness, right? And so when that breaks down, as what happens at the end of the Old Kingdom, you get these texts which describe the kinds of chaos that exists throughout the land. And this is how they describe those things. So what I'm I don't want to make too much of the fact that the Ipuwer text juxtaposes the river becoming blood and the others from outside coming into Egypt, and that's exactly, of course, what's happening at the time of the Israelites as well. And it's clear from Exodus 1 that the Pharaoh perceives the Israelites as foreigners, powerful, too many, swarming, mighty, and so on. So I hope that's somewhat of an answer to what you're asking, but it's Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess so. It's just so is it seen as the barbarians that have come from the outside have sort of polluted the river and made it not drinkable?
I wouldn't go that far. I would just say this is part of it. It's obviously an excerpt from a much longer text. This is a litany of the things that are wrong with Egypt today. Okay, let's put it in that sense.